Hi guys, I am working in week 5 for my online reading class, and the homework assignment for this week is practicing talking to the text, and we're given a reading. It's called The Lives of a Cell. So I printed it out because whenever I am reading, I like to actually have the text in front of me. It's hard for me to just read online because I want to write on it, because that's what good readers do. That's what I do so that I can understand it better. Excuse me. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a think out loud and a talking to the text at the same time. I have the text up here for you to see, and I have it in front of me so I can write on it, but I'm going to do a think out loud and talking to the text in this video so you can watch me do it, and we'll just kind of see what happens. So I've never read this before. This is a reading for the online class, so I'm going to start doing it. Okay, so as a reader, the first thing that I'm drawn to, my eyes want to scan this entire page, but I'm going to show you how my eyes are looking at it first. So the first thing I notice is 1971. I was born in 1979, so I'm like, like it seems like an older reading, but then I'm like, well, I was born in 1979, so it's not that old. But I'm thinking, okay, so it's from the 70s. The author's name is Lewis Thomas, and the title of the piece is The Lives of a Cell. So I'm thinking like, oh, it's scientific. This seems exciting. Like my body's like perking up like, oh, I get to read about science. I can see the text here, but the next place that my eye wanders to is first published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1971, collected in The Lives of a Cell 1974. I'm looking at this footnote. I really like footnotes because they offer advice. They offer history, background information that's not in the actual text, and so I find them fascinating. So let me just jump into the reading. We are told that the trouble with modern man is that he has been trying to detach himself from nature. What this makes me think of is my creative writing class and how the theme in creative writing is nature, and just how I love nature and I love going on walks. It reminds me of my connection with the area where I live. I walk the Ojai Oakview Trail, the bike trail, and I've just recently started walking it and noticing there's so many birds in that area that I don't even know their names. I know there's scrub jays, and there's little birds with like little red markings on their necks. When they're flying, you can see the red, and when they land, you can't see it. But it reminds me of my relationship to nature. It says, he sits in the topmost tiers of polymer, glass, and steel, dangling his pulsing legs, surveying at a distance the writhing life of the planet. That kind of makes me sad when I read it, just because I imagine a man or a woman, a person kind of stuck in a building away from nature when I read that. In this scenario, man comes on as a stupendous, lethal force, and the earth is pictured as something delicate, like rising bubbles at the surface of a country pond, or flights of fragile birds. This reminds me of my kids. We talk a lot about the earth and recycling and picking up trash, and they're so little, but they're so aware of like taking care of the earth. So that kind of is what it reminds me of here. But it's also interesting to me because I don't necessarily see the earth as delicate. I see it as like this strong, like I think Mother Earth, and I think of like this strong, fierce energy. But it is the illusion to think that there's anything fragile about the life of the earth. Surely it is the toughest membrane imaginable in the universe, opaque to probability, impermeable to death. Yeah, that reminds me of like Moana and the land, the earth in that Disney movie, and how strong the earth is. It's this force of nature. We are the delicate part, transient and vulnerable as cilia. I remember learning about cilia in biology. It's like the little hairs, I remember them as being like little hairs. Nor is it a new thing for man to invent an existence that he imagines to be above the rest of life. This has been the most consistent intellectual exertion down the millennia. As illusion, it has never worked out to his satisfaction in the past any more than it does today. Man is embedded in nature. I agree with that. That makes me think of like the, what's it called? Not the chain of command, but like that, how we look at evolution and we look at like the survival of the fittest, that mentality, that whole Darwinian mentality, and how oftentimes man is seen at like the top of this like food chain. And to me it kind of seems silly because man is like weak compared to the earth's energy. You know, long after man disappears from the earth will probably still exist, or exist and then flourish. I think, I'm not sure if you've heard this or not, but I've heard that you know, when man fails to exist on the earth will just grow and be abundant, unlike it is with man on it. And so I find that interesting, that man is embedded in nature. And the biological science of recent years has been making this a more urgent fact of life. The new hard problem will be to cope with the dawning, intensifying realization of just how interlocked we are. When I think of the word interlocked, I think of this. Like, I think of like things that are inextricably bound together, that word interlocked. So man and earth, and this connection that they share. The old clung to notions most of us have held about our special lordship are being deeply undermined. Item, that's interesting to me that this paragraph starts with item. A good case can be made for our non-existence as entities. We are not made up, as we had always supposed, of successively enriched packets of our own parts. We are shared, rented, occupied. That sounds really poetic. That we are shared, rented, and occupied. At the interior of our cells, driving them, providing the oxidative, so I think like oxygen, oxidative energy that sends out for improvement of each shining day, are the mitochondria or bacteria. Like, I think of the word bacteria when I read that. And in a strict sense, they are not ours. They turn out to be little separate creatures, the colonial posterity of migrant prokaryotes, probably primitive bacteria that swam into ancestral precursors of our eukaryotic cells and stayed there. So as a reader, I'm like overwhelmed by the biological terminology, but some of it is familiar, so I'm not that overwhelmed. I'm still following what the writer is saying. So I kind of hear the writer saying that we're like bacteria. We think we're lords of the earth, but we're just cells. That's kind of what I hear the writer saying, and I tend to agree with it. Ever since they have maintained themselves and their ways, replicating in their own fashion, privately, with their own DNA and RNA quite different from ours, the difference between maybe plant and animal, plant and human cells. They are as much symbionts as rhizobal bacteria in the roots of beans. Without them, we would not move a muscle, drum a finger, think a thought. So here I'm like, yeah, we need them. You know, these cells that make up who we are. Mitochondria are stable and reasonable lodgers, and I choose to trust them. But what of the other little animals similarly established in my cells, sorting and balancing me, clustering me together? My centrioles, basal bodies, basal bodies, and probably a good many other more obscure tiny beings that work inside my cells. It feels very philosophical to be talking about the cells in your body. Never really thought of it in that way. Each with its own special genome, are as foreign and as essential as aphids in anthills. So when I think of aphids, I think of like these little kind of like, not annoying, but like definitely symbiotic creatures. But it seems weird. I imagine them, like I've seen them on green plants. So like dandelions specifically, like if you pick dandelions or flowers and you kind of look under the actual petal or the top stem of the flower, you often see little aphids or like tiny little green, and they kind of blend in with the flower. And so to imagine them here, like in this sentence, in anthill, seems silly and out of place or foreign. My cells are no longer the pure line entities I was raised with. They are ecosystems more complex than Jamaica Bay. I don't know about Jamaica Bay, but I'm imagining it now, green and blue as an ecosystem, and thinking about my own cells as more complex than Jamaica Bay. I like to think that they work in my interest, that each breath they draw for me, but perhaps it is they who walk through the local park in the early morning, sensing my senses, listening to my music, thinking my thoughts. So now I'm starting to think of this interlocked relationship that was mentioned earlier between cells and man, or cells and humans. The relationship between myself and my cells. Is it me listening to my music, or is it my cells? It's kind of a curious question. I am consoled somewhat by the thought that the green plants are in the same fix. They cannot be plants or green without their chloroplasts, which run the photosynthetic enterprise that generate oxygen for the rest of us. I remember learning about this kind of stuff in biology and thinking it was so interesting, the chloroplasts and the chlorophyll, and photosynthesis specifically. Especially, there's a video that I'm thinking of specifically, this YouTube video that shows the life cycle of a dandelion, and it's just really interesting because you see the different phases of the flower that kind of dies and turns into the dandelion, and most people don't know it's the same plant. That's what this makes me think of. As it turns out, chloroplasts are also separate creatures with their own genomes, speaking their own language. We carry stores of DNA in our nuclei that may have come in at one time or another from the fusion of ancestral cells and the linking of ancestral organisms in symbiosis. Our genomes are catalogs of instructions from all kinds of sources in nature. I'm really curious about the word genome, because I'm like, okay, what does genome mean? I'm trying to figure out what the word genome means without stopping and looking it up. But it reminds me of DNA and RNA, which were mentioned earlier. So it says here, our genomes are catalogs of instructions from all kinds of sources in nature, kind of like our filing system and how we learn, how we integrate with our environment. Where am I on here? As for me, I'm grateful for differentiation and speciation, but I cannot feel as separate an entity as I did a few years ago before I was told these things, nor I should think can anyone else. To me, it's like awareness of something. Once you're told something, you become aware, and then it changes the way you think. It's kind of what this line makes me think. And then we have the word again, item, which is interesting. I'm not sure why it's in there. Item, the uniformity of the Earth's life, more astonishing than its diversity, is accountable by the high probability that we derived originally from some single cell fertilized in a bolt of lightning as the Earth cooled. So I've heard that idea, this whole being derived from a single cell, which is amazing. It's interesting. It makes me think of those debates between creationism versus evolution. And I adhere to both of those theories. I don't find those theories to be incompatible with imagination. So again, creationism versus evolution, how we evolved as humans. evolution, evolution. I like this idea of fertilized in a bolt of lightning as the Earth cooled. That's interesting. It reminds me of the Big Bang Theory. It is from the progeny of this parent cell that we take our looks. We still share genes around, and the resemblance of the enzymes of grasses to those of whales is a family resemblance. The viruses, instead of being single-minded agents of disease and death, now begin to look more like mobile genes. Evolution is still an infinitely long and tedious biological game, with only the winners staying at the table. It reminds me of Charles Darwin's survival of the fittest, the whole dog-eat-dog type of thing. But the rules are beginning to look more flexible. We live in a dancing matrix of viruses. They dart rather like bees from organism to organism, from plant to insect to mammal to meat and back again, and into the sea, tugging along pieces of this genome, strings of genes from that, transplanting grafts of DNA. So strings of genes, I like that phrase to kind of define the genome. Passing around heredity as though at a great party, They may be mechanisms for keeping new mutant kinds of DNA in the widest circulation among us. That reminds